Hi everybody, welcome to the video. My name is Midway and today I welcome you all to the part 2 of the Holy Paladin Beginner Guide, this time around centered around Mythic Plus. So we'll be talking about builds, we'll be talking about individual talents that are important in Mythic Plus, and we will also be looking at some clips, some gameplay tips that I'll try to give you, trying to understand how you are supposed to play Holy Paladin in Mythic Plus, how to deal with all that burst AoE damage, how to go through your rotation in a normal basis, min-max your damage, etc. So we will try and cover everything that we can in this short video, so let's get into it. Okay, so let me shortly give you my build, the build that I play in Mythic Plus and that most people are playing in Mythic Plus, and that is the following. Now, it's a build where we use normal wings. We're not really using Avenging Crusader in dungeons anymore, and that's because ever since 10.0.7, they did add some talents that buff our core healing, especially our Word of Glory healing, a lot. Therefore, making us not really need to rely on Avenging Crusader that much. Even before, it was already able, we were already able to just use normal wings, because normal wings are always going to be more damage, since it's also going to be buffing the damage of our consecration. But regardless, this is the build that we use right now. There is different variations of this build. Of course, there's always going to be different things. One of those variations is the one where we don't use Blessing of Freedom. There are scenarios where you don't really benefit at all from having freedom, so you can always go ahead and do this. You can drop that freedom, excuse me, and just pick longer duration on horse. That way you can have more mobility, since the freedom might just be completely useless in certain dungeons. But usually I just have two builds where I just switch that. I have a freedom build and a no freedom build. I'll give you both down in the description. Now, things that I want to point out about this build are the following. Now, we are playing with Breaking Dawn, and that is because there is scenarios where in Mythic Plus you will want to be using Light of Dawn. Now, I know I mentioned in the first video, if you did watch it, if you didn't, please go ahead and do that, because it's going to be very important for your core rotation. And if you have any doubts and you're beginner to Holy Paladin, you should have that really down. You should be very aware of the whole core rotation and how that flows. Breaking Dawn is gonna enable you to benefit a lot more and a lot more reliably from those AoE scenarios where you will naturally just have the party a lot more stacked up, and being able to hit pretty much everybody, or at least 4 people with Light of Dawn, will actually generate more healing than using Word of Glory. So Breaking Dawn in many dungeons, in many scenarios, will be very beneficial for that same reason, because even if you are stacked, somebody might not be within those 15 yards for whatever reason. So it's always pretty nice to be able to actually make sure that you hit those people in those AoE scenarios. Well, for the most part, as we did mention before as well, Word of Glory will be what you are going to be using the most in dungeons. So why is Word of Glory that strong now, and why do we not really use Avenging Crusader? That is because, as we mentioned, we have some talents. Namely, we have Strength of Conviction, which is making our Word of Glory do 20% more healing when you're standing in Consecration. So what I want you to do is to always have Consecration in the ground in Mythic Plus. It's a must for the sake of both damage and healing, namely because of this talent, but also it's just your main damage spell. So one of the things that will be very important in the planning and planning out how to do a lot of healing as a Holy Paladin will be to have that Consecration uptime on point, have it on the ground as often as you can. Now, Word of Glory is also getting buffed by Blessing of Dawn. It's going to give you 30% more healing through Word of Glory, as well as Light of Dawn when you consume this buff. So that's why now Word of Glory is doing a lot more healing than it did before on 10.0.7, and that's why Word of Glory is just that much stronger, and therefore we don't really use Avenging Crusader. Now, another important thing is going to be kick. We have a kick as a Holy Paladin, and therefore you need to get used to it. I know it's going to be pretty advanced, and if you're already struggling with the base rotation, adding up the notion of having a kick and being able to contribute to the dungeon by kicking stuff might be a little bit too much, but it's good practice to, whenever you have a lot of downtime, to be able to keep this on cooldown. Just kick whatever, just try and kick whatever, then you can also focus on kicking important things. But kicking is gonna make your dungeon runs a lot smoother. In lower dungeons, I've done my way from 0 to 3k this season. I've plugged everything, and I've realized that the lower you are in key score, the less people kick. So I know it's gonna be messy, but you yourself doing it and contributing to it is just gonna make things a lot smoother. The more people kick, the better everything's gonna be going down. So if people don't kick stuff and a lot of casts go through, healing is just going to be much more difficult. So yeah, get used to kicking, get used to looking at when people kick, have some sort of tracker, but just really be mindful that you have it and you should be using it. So Holy Paladin is a very tanky spec in Mythic Plus because of things like Sanctified Plates as well as Fading Light. You if you want to read through those talents and know what they do, I have videos on that as well, on where we go over the talents and the changes on 10.0.7. But those two talents alone make you a lot tankier than before. We have a lot of armor, a lot of AoE mitigation naturally through having scientific plates, as well as just having a massive absorb shield on us that keeps on regenerating as we do damage and healing. So Holy Paladin is tanky. You should not be afraid of dying that often. You should much more be afraid of other people dying, and that's why timing is key. We will talk about the timing of things. I have some gameplay illustrations or examples later on, but that is some of the very important parts of the build. Other thing that I want to point out is, of course, we are playing with Beacon of Virtue, so get used to timing this properly. It's very important that you actually make the best use out of Beacon of Virtue. It's better to save Beacon of Virtue and use it when it's really necessary than to put it on cooldown and not having when you actually need it. We'll talk about that later a little bit more. Divine Favor is part of this build. I knew in the previous video, I know that I said that we don't really want to be using Holy Light and Flash of Light that much, but Divine Favor is an extra tool that we are now able to pick in this build because of some of the changes that happened in 10.0.7. And being able to have this Divine Favor means that we have another burst cooldown, another way of doing some big burst. Not that big of a burst, but it's a little bit more healing that we can funnel through the beacons. So it's another tool that it's a good practice to be able to use. Just be mindful that this exists. Keep track of this cooldown and the buff when you have it. You can also, of course, use my UI if you want to do so. I have the cooldown right there. You can just pop it and you see it, and then you consume it and it's gone. So if you want to have some sort of tracking and you are interested in my UI, you can always get that down in the description. I have a whole video on my UI as well. It will always be down in the description. But yeah, it's another tool that's part of this build. Knowing that this exists is going to be very important. So yeah, keep using that, and it's gonna be helping you do some big burst. But once again, that will always be a matter of timing things right, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So another thing that's important as well is echoing blessings, knowing that Blessing of Sacrifice is not just strong on its own while it's lasting. If you are picking this talent here, it's also going to be providing some extra damage mitigation after the buff is gone. So that makes our sack that much more powerful. Picking this talent here means that you're just able to make somebody's life a lot easier for a little while, actually quite a long while, even though it's not that much mitigation. But yeah, important to go down this path and pick that, even though this talent is really kind of useless. Do not play around Unending Light too much, even though you have max stacks of this. You don't really want to be caring too much about this. This is going to be some free healing that you will get if you are using some Lazadon at some point, which you probably will not be doing much. You should always be using Word of Glory as your main source of healing anyways, but if you do manage to actually sneak in some Lazadon and do some healing through them, Unending Light will also be a benefit that you get out of that. And of course, importantly, it's gonna be the Empyrean Legacy. Empyrean Legacy is gonna be a buff that's gonna be very important for you to keep track of. If you are gonna be throwing a Judgment, you should know that the next time you Word of Glory, you're also gonna get a Latadon out of that. So keep this in mind. It's something of a cooldown. You should be able to think about this as a cooldown, knowing when this is ready. You can go ahead and go to a dummy, throw it. You will see the buff if you are using my UI. If not, well, make sure you have some way of seeing it, but you throw it, you have a buff right there, and this should be thought of as almost a cooldown. Once you have this, you know that, then you apply your beacons, and then once you throw that Word of Glory, it's also going to generate a Latadon, meaning that Word of Glory, it's going to be even stronger. So yeah, that's some of the tips of this build, some of the intricacies of it. Blessing of Summer is a whole thing on its own, but pretty much just keep it on cooldown. Use Blessing of Summer on those that are going to be doing the most damage by themselves. Do not use it on classes that use pets, for example, Beast Mastery Hunters or Unholy Death Knights. If they don't do the damage by themselves, for example, also Windwalkers, do not use them on them because it's going to do 0 damage. Just use them on anybody that has cooldowns ready. For example, I don't know, Red Paladin, a Shadow Priest, a Boomkin. Those are good targets for using Blessing of Summer on. Blessing of Winter, just use it on yourself for the sake of mana. Blessing of Spring, you can use it on tanks that heal themselves so they can regenerate more health on their own. It's almost like a healing cooldown for them. You can also use it on yourself. And Blessing of Autumn, you can use it on classes that benefit a lot from CDR, for example, Fire Mages and so, or just use it on yourself if you're struggling a little bit with healing and you are fearing that you might not have some tools ready for the next burst of AoE. But that's about it. I don't really want to get too much deeper into the talents. I'll give you the talents, of course, the builds down in the description, but now let's look a little bit more at the gameplay and doing damage. Right, so first of all, how do you do a lot of damage as a Holy Paladin in Mythic Plus? As we mentioned, it's really all about having Consecration down as much as possible. Consecration is going to be your main source of damage and also going to be providing you some healing benefits. So if you are not used to keeping this on the ground 24/7, that is the first thing that I want you to change. I know it's not going to be doing any healing or pretty much any healing, no matter what the talents you're picking are. Those talents won't really matter too much. It's all about having that down so you can benefit from the increased healing from Water Glory. That's why it's not just damage, it's also healing. Therefore, keep it on cooldown, keep it on the ground. Not really on cooldown because you don't really want to be using it when you don't have to, since the cooldown on Consecration is shorter than the duration. But that's just really a tool for you to be able to repositioning the Consecration, since its range is not too big and you are as melee going to be moving a lot. So therefore, just try and keep it under you as much as you can. Having some sort of weak aura to let you know if you are on top of it, just like Prot has, is probably going to be pretty handy. But next up, how do you do more damage as a Holy Paladin? Well, there's some tools for that. Mainly going to be applying to hierarchies, but in case you are really trying to do those, one of the things that's really important is going to be to have 2 embellishments with increased potion duration. So crafting 2 items and then embellishing the increased potion duration onto them is going to mean that the potions you have are going to be lasting for an entire minute. So what do you do with that? You are going to be using the AoE potions, the ones that are right here. The potions of Choking Disclosure. These potions do some AoE damage around you. They are pretty nice to just do some AoE. So you pop this as often as possible and it's just going to be doing a lot of damage for you. I know it's not too much damage, but as Holy Paladins, we don't really have many more options to get a lot of damage out of our kit. So using those potions, they're going to be amounting for, in a very good dungeon, like 4 to 5 million damage over the whole thing. That is a lot. That's one of the ways of min-maxing damage as a Holy Paladin. Therefore, I would really recommend doing that if you can, but besides the consumables and stuff, other things you can do are just keep pretty much everything on cooldown. When you are really trying to do damage as a Holy Paladin, it's gonna be about keeping everything on cooldown as often as possible. If you are on to do damage mode, literally you don't care about healing, then you just Holy Shock the mobs, you just Holy Shock for DPS, you Judgment for DPS, you just try and make the most out of your Judgment buff as well, the buff that you get from the talent, the Greater Judgment. Keeping everything on cooldown is literally that simple. There's not really much more to it because the kit is not that complex, it's not tailored to doing a lot of damage. Of course, also using your Holy Power for Shield of the Righteous in big packs. If the packs are small, you might want to be fishing for procs of Awakening by just using Words of Glory or maybe Lights of Dawn. Usually Lights of Dawn because we have second Sunrise, which gives you the chance of proccing a second Light of Dawn, giving you another chance of proccing Awakening, therefore getting wings. But that's very specific of different scenarios. For the most part, and as a general rule, if you're just trying to do damage and there's no healing to be done, literally just keep everything on cooldown and just focus on the damage. Now, what about the healing? The healing and whipping it into with the damage, that's when things get a lot more complex. There's no secret formula. It comes down to being able to assess what you can afford to use and not to use. So if you see that there's no healing required in like maybe a couple GCDs down the line, there will be some, maybe you can afford to use a Holy Shock offensively. So instead of just keeping it off cooldown, just go ahead and use it offensively. It's gonna be adding up with the Glimmer, with everything else, generating the Holy Power, being able to then use Shield of the Righteous offensively. All of those little things are gonna be adding up, and it really is just about actions per minute. Since mana is not really an issue in most cases in Mythic Plus, there will be scenarios where it will be, but for the most part, it shouldn't be. You should be able to sit in between packs and stuff, or in between before the boss and such. Just try and keep things going, try and keep your rotation flowing, use things. Now, it's gonna be down to your skill, your being able to read the fight, read the scenario you're in, if you can afford to use something offensively or not, if you can afford to go for Crusader Strikes, if you can afford to use that Holy Shock offensively. Otherwise, maybe you wanna be saving it for healing, but regardless, that's what it really comes down to. Keep everything on cooldown, and most importantly, keep Consecration on the ground 24/7. The potions are going to be going a long way, increasing your damage, but also there is going to be other options. For example, using a different this other different enchant onto your weapon. This is really advanced, and I don't really recommend using this unless you are very comfortable with your healing, but you could also use this other weapon enchant that's also going to be doing some AoE damage. That's for those that really want to focus on doing more damage as a Holy Paladin, but really, Holy Paladin is not going to be able to pull the biggest numbers, and I think most of you will probably be here because you're struggling with your healing, so let's talk about that. So how do you do healing as a Holy Paladin in Mythic Plus? How do you deal with the big burst scenarios? Well, as we mentioned before, it all comes down to being able to have that timing right. Timing your beacons of virtue with the incoming damage, having the setup ready to pump a lot of healing through the beacons when you really need it. There's many scenarios in the dungeons that we had in Season 1 where this shines really good. For example, on Hirja, on Fenrir, I don't know, there's other bosses that there's going to be a lot of focused AoE healing during a big window. For example, the first boss in Shadow Moon, things like that, where you just suddenly are overwhelmed by a lot of AoE damage and you think, oh well, if I am not ready and my timing is not right, I am dead. Well, that's what I really want to stress about. Sometimes if you are going to be panicking about the healing, or you might think that you are going to have somebody die, it's probably better for you as a Holy Paladin to take a step back, wait a little bit, assess the situation and think, okay, what do I have ready? Is my Beacon of Virtue ready, or am I gonna need it in the next, I don't know, 12 seconds? That's what the cooldown of Beacon of Virtue is, right? If I'm not mistaken, it's 15-second cooldown actually. So it really comes down to assessing what cooldowns you have and when you're gonna need them. If you use a Beacon of Virtue for some reason right before you're gonna be needing it, and it's on cooldown when you need it, then you're probably dead, because there's no other answer to the AoE damage besides probably Divine Toll. So it's all about juggling your two major cooldowns, Divine Toll and Beacon of Virtue. Now, Beacon of Virtue together with Divine Toll is pretty much a get out of jail free card. It's gonna be the biggest combo, the biggest amount of healing. You're gonna be pretty much stopping everybody. So that is your main source of healing. I'm pretty sure you know about this, but whenever you will have this happen, you will be feeling pretty safe if you are able to combo these two things together. Now, what happens when you don't have Divine Toll? Well, you still can do a lot of healing through Beacon of Virtue, but that's when the setup really comes through. So you need to be ready with your Holy Power. Make sure you have 5 Holy Power, or at least 3, so you can back it up. As soon as you apply the beacons, you can back that up with some Word of Glory healing right after. What did we talk about? Consecration. Consecration will buff the healing of your Word of Glory, so make sure you have that Consecration down on the ground before you try and make the big healing. Now, it should always be down on the ground anyways, but just in case, try and think about it before you do it. It's gonna be a lot of little things that you're gonna have to time right, and to be fair, it's pretty complex. It's much more complex than it used to be in the past, but that's what it comes down to. Those little steps that you need to think about before the damage happens. Holy Paladin right now is really just about that. It's being mindful of the timing, knowing the fight and knowing what you have, and do not overuse resources. It's better to not have anybody die and greed on some resources so you can use them when you really need them, than to use them before because you might have thought that you could afford them or not, and then you don't have anything and you really have no answer right after that. So make the best out of your Beacon of Virtue. If you want, or if you have to, be greedy with it. Just don't use it until you really need it, and when the time to use it comes, put it up, and make sure that when you put it up, you already have your Holy Power ready, you already have your stuff on the ground, maybe your Light's Hammer, maybe your Consecration. Pop those wings and go ham. Now, when or what kind of healing you want to be doing to funnel through the beacons, that really depends. If you are able to hit pretty much everybody, or at least 4 people with your Light of Dawn, then Light of Dawn is going to be a better answer. But however, Word of Glory transfers better apply. Apparently there's some sort of multipliers with how the transfer happens with Light of Dawn. That's what I've heard, really not really sure about this one, but Word of Glory is going to be your main source anyways, because you might not be able to guarantee that you're going to be hitting at least 4 people with Light of Dawn. So usually you just want to be using those Words of Glory with your beacon. So you just put the beacon down and then you Word of Glory, and you should just see the people going up in health. So looking at the clips, you will see how this works. It's going to be something you're going to really have to build muscle memory around. There's no real answer for every single scenario, but it kind of goes just like that. You apply your Consecration in the ground, you try and generate some Holy Power, have some answers ready, and when you apply your beacons, then that's when you just funnel all the healing. Be really mindful of the cooldown of things and of the timing of things. One little trick that it's sometimes useful is to precast a Holy Light, maybe using that Divine Favor as well. And once the cast is finishing, you spam that Beacon of Virtue, and it's gonna be applying the beacons, but also transferring the healing from that precasted Holy Light through the beacons. So that's a way of sneaking a little bit of extra healing during the window of the beacons. That's not that advanced, but it's a little trick you can do to just sneaking even more healing during that window. But that's really what it comes down to, is to make the best out of that window, be very mindful of the timings, and it's really just about that, honestly. Just be very mindful of what you have ready for when you need the damage, and having enough spare brain power within doing your entire rotation, which is honestly the same we talked about in the previous video. It really applies. It's the same thing. The rotation we talked about in the previous video still applies to everything in Mythic Plus, still applies to everything in raiding. So while you do your rotation and you deal with the attrition healing, when you need to the big burst and the big AoE healing, just be mindful of the timing of things and be ready for it when it happens. That is the key, the answer for Holy Paladin. It's gonna depend a lot on the scenario and depend a lot on your muscle memory and how well you flow through the rotation. So those are the tricks there. So now let's look at some gameplay and let's try and highlight this with that. Alright, so as we mentioned before, the pretty good scenario for looking at this AoE healing as a Holy Paladin and how to deal with it is the first boss in Shadowmoon. So here we have a clip of the first boss. Slow down a little bit so we can talk about it. So when we start the fight, we know that there's no healing to be done after a couple seconds, but I know that shortly after there's gonna be one of those AoE scenarios. So what do here is I generate some Holy Power, I'd wait for this damage to happen, and then I apply my beacons, I pop wings, and I consume that Holy Power with some Word of Glory. As you can see down there, there's gonna be the spells that I'm using. So having those beacons ready, having wings active, and being able to wait for the damage to happen with that Holy Power means that I'm able to instantly revert that damage without actually even needing to use beacon, or sorry, actually Divine Toll. So once we are out of that scenario and we know that there's gonna be no healing to be done, which usually happens a lot in Mythic Plus, you have that big burst of AoE healing and then you are pretty much free to just DPS. Then we can go ahead and just do that, go back to just using our normal rotation to do some damage. But I know that shortly after, once again, it's gonna happen. So what do I do here? I put down my Light's Hammer here. I have a little bit of a mistake because I forget that it's gonna be going through the Dark Eclipse, so I'm gonna be wasting that Light's Hammer pretty much. But I know that shortly after, of course, there's gonna be another big burst of AoE healing to be done, so I wait for with some Holy Power, I consume my Divine Favor, I apply the beacons, and I revert that instantly. But I know that, again, afterwards, there's gonna be another scenario with AoE healing. Beacon is down because I just used it to revert the damage from the other mechanic, but I have Divine Toll, so I knew that I could rely on another cooldown to revert the next sort of damage. It's always having a game plan. You need to have a game plan of what cooldown you're gonna have to the next AoE damage, to the next sort of burst, because really it's all about not dying. It's what's gonna come down to is not dying. So once again, the damage is mitigated, or rather it's reverted, so we can go back into the normal rotation using our spells, trying to make a lot of damage, and that's really about it. Once we're done with that, once again, thinking about, oh, what's coming next? So here we're gonna have another AoE scenario happening. So we have the big burst, we gonna need to just wait for a little bit here. It's all about timing, but we have the Holy Power ready. As you can see, we have the proc of Empyrean Legacy ready, and it's gonna be happening now. That's why I didn't use the Beacon of Virtue there, because I knew that after the big burst, that's when the AoE that really matters is gonna happen. So that's why I saved my beacon for that, and then I go ahead and consume all the healing that I can, all the Holy Power. I spend it on Words of Glory, I consumed it in my favor. I knew that I was able to afford not using Beacon of Virtue for the first AoE damage, whatever that was called, the Dark Eclipse, because I'm gonna need it for the next mechanic. That's gonna be the big AoE burst with the Whispers of the Dark. So there we go, I have a game plan. I did a mistake before on the first Dark Eclipse, because I didn't really have to use Beacon of Virtue there. I rather use it on the Whispers of the Dark, but since I had Divine Toll before, I could still afford that mistake, sort of. But once again, same thing's gonna happen now. It's gonna be a Dark Eclipse. After the Dark Eclipse, there's gonna be another Whispers of the Dark, so another AoE. What do? 5 Holy Power, wings are ready. I can afford some, so nobody dies here. I'm ready with the 5 Holy Power when the Eclipse is gonna happen. And once it starts, I'm gonna be applying the beacons. It's shortly now here, it happens. Apply the beacons, and then we consume our Holy Power. We are lucky to get a proc. We have Divine Toll, so we can also go ahead and do that. You just have the resources you need ready for when they are necessary. That's really what it comes down to. Look at the cooldown of the abilities, look at when they're gonna be happening, and have a game plan of what you will need to revert that. Now, this is a fight where everything is really planned out, and there's not many dangerous scenarios. That's why Shadowmoon is usually the dungeon that most people clear in the highest level, because it's pretty simple. Most of the bosses are pretty easy, they don't really do much damage, but still, have that game plan. That's what it really comes down to. When you do not need the healing, don't really waste things that you will probably need down the line. So here I have another bit of a confusion, because I thought the Dark Eclipse would happen before, but just applying beacons, we had some healing ready, therefore we can revert things. It's all about that. We have beacons ready, we have some Holy Power ready because we didn't waste it before just in case, then we can instantly try and revert some stuff back. Now, here for example, the Whispers of the Dark just happened, so we know that we can use the beacons to revert the damage that happens immediately after this Dark Eclipse. We can afford to do that because the spell queuing sometimes happens like that. Sometimes some mechanics get reverted. If you know the fight very well, you will know that that's also a part of the fight. You need to be aware of that. But in any case, you have to always prepare for those not really planned out scenarios, or maybe you just get confused. So always have a backup plan, always have something to back it up. don't waste your beacons, don't waste your divine toll, don't waste your holy power when there's going to be healing necessary. That is what it all comes down to. Have your resources ready before they are necessary. That's the real way of healing as a holy paladin. Damage happens, we have holy power, we have beacons, we have divine toll, it's gone, it doesn't matter. It could do double the damage, I would be ready no matter what because I have that much healing ready. And of course, also playing around with your Aura Mastery. Aura Mastery is also a tool for healing. If you can plan ahead and use it before some big burst is going to happen, just go ahead and use it. If it's going to be dangerous enough, then just might as well use it before you actually need to do the healing. That way, you actually mitigate the damage. That's really what the point of this whole thing is. So I hope this video illustrated what I meant by planning. That's really what it comes down to, is planning. The build that I showed you is all about that, planning and also doing a lot of damage. And yeah, hope this was useful to you. No, it might be a long video, but it really is pretty hard to condense everything into a short format here and give the tips that I need to give. I know you will probably still have a million doubts, so go ahead and drop them in the description, or not the description, the comments below. I'll be more than gladly able to, or willing to answer them. So yeah, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one, probably centered around mythic, rather raiding. So yeah, bye bye, see you later.